1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 15 through 18. But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. For I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. All right, so we jump into 1 Corinthians 9, beginning in verses 15 through 18. For those of you who are going through the handout or doing the leader guide, obviously verses 1 through 15 are missing. Where are they? We'll kind of summarize them as we go through this, but really we're coming to the end of Paul's argument, and so just centering in on these final verses, because passage breakdown for the first 15 verses would have been pretty crazy for us to do. So we're just focusing on these last 4 verses. And let's jump into the beginning. It begins with the word but, which tells us that whatever is being said here is counter to what came in verses 1 through 15. It's counter to that. And so as we go through, let's look for some more clues. But I have not used any of these rights. I'm going to underline that in yellow. We need to define these rights before we go any further. And obviously, these rights then would relate to what was said in verses 1 through 15. To summarize very quickly, Paul lays out several cases from multiple different examples to say that an apostle, a pastor, deserves to collect a living wage from those they serve. He goes to Deuteronomy, I think 25, verse 4, to make that point that you're not allowed to muzzle the ox while it treads the grain. That'd be obviously tempting. You wouldn't want to muzzle your ox and have it eat all of your grain as it's treading it, but God says, hey, if the ox is in there doing his work, treading the grain, don't muzzle him. He gets to eat part of the grain as he treads it, and now that is being applied to the apostle and to the pastor, that they have a right, they have a right to collect a living wage from those they serve. And then Paul comes into verse 15. But I have not used any of these rights. Remember that this is coming in the context of chapters 8 through 10. At the end of chapter 8, Paul taught them to forego their rights. And so in verses 1 through 18, Paul uses himself as an example of one who forgoes his rights for the sake of others. And as we'll see in today's text, also for his own reward. So Paul says, I have not used any of his rights. Remember that he warned them against the exercising of rights. And he's saying, I have not used any of these rights. And not only that, I am not writing this for what purpose? In the hope that you will do such things for me. I am not doing it for this reason. I'm not doing this. I'm not explaining that I have the right to money so that you would do such things for me. We could, again, go in yellow. What are such things, Paul? And the answer, same thing as these rights. So up here, it's not that he's explaining all of this so that he can make money. That's not the reason for bringing up this argument. And he shows us why. Here's what he says. I would rather die than, he's making a comparison here between dying than allowing anyone to deprive me of this boast. So we know that this boast then must in some way relate to the foregoing of these rights and not getting paid. The boast is related to somehow giving up rights and not getting paid. So let's I'm going to use this boast, these rights, such things, and we're going to see if we can kind of figure out and define what this boast is. What do you mean, Paul, by this boast? We know that because of this word for, that he's linking this thought here, I would rather die than someone deprive me of this boast, to this thought up here, that he's not used his rights and he doesn't hope that they will suddenly start doing this. He's gonna continue his line of reasoning for, and this is where it starts to get kind of confusing. So we'll have to be careful here. When I preach the gospel, I cannot boast. This is another just small piece here. When I preach the gospel, I cannot boast. So this boast is not preaching the gospel. It's related to the foregoing of rights, and it is not preaching the gospel. When I preach the gospel, I cannot boast. How do we know that? Because boasting for him has nothing to do with preaching the gospel. It's just personal boast. He'll boast in the cross, but he can't boast for anything in and of himself. And we would ask the question, Paul, why not? Why can't you boast for preaching the gospel? And he gives us the reason. Since. So all of this right here, verse 16, when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast. He's going to explain why. The why is answered right here. I am compelled to preach. Compelled. And compelled is going to come up in opposition to another word in the next sentence, voluntarily. So let's look at the link. I'm going to highlight compelled and then voluntarily down here, and we're going to see the link to that in a second. It says, I cannot boast since because I am compelled to preach. So somehow being compelled to preach means that he's not allowed to boast. Being compelled means no boast. Being compelled, no boast. In fact, he's going to double down on the compilation of being compelled right here. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. So this word woe, right? He's kind of almost invoking a curse on himself. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. Now, do we get in trouble for not preaching the gospel? Sure, we should. It's not something that we should neglect, but Paul's going further than that. He's saying, woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. Similarly, up here he said, I would rather die than someone to deprive me of this boast. So just a second ago, we said that the boast cannot be preaching the gospel. But over here, he says, woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. And this woe to me, it's certainly connected in some way to this, I would rather die. So we're getting closer to a definition, even though the water's getting pretty murky right now. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. But again, somehow the gospel and the boast aren't the same thing. So let's keep going. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. So we get another little unit right here. If not voluntary, I'm simply discharging the trust committed to me. All right, we'll use this if, and then again we could put in a then. If I do this, if not voluntarily, then I am. So we got two if-then statements. If I preach voluntarily, which is the opposite of being compelled to preach, I have a reward. So Paul's saying, I'm compelled to preach. He is not this guy. He is not the person who just preaches voluntarily. He is compelled to preach, and there is a woe upon him if he does not do so. Now, if he was a guy who could preach voluntarily, then he could have a reward. And here, reward definitely means finances. It means making some money. But if not voluntarily, which is the category that Paul's in, so he's not in this voluntarily category, he's in the not voluntary. He is compelled to preach. Then I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. And this really gives us the why. So this whole piece right here, I'm going to go verse 16, verse 16 to the first half of 17. this should give us a giant question in our minds. Paul, what is the boast? Why are you compelled? Why do you have a reward voluntarily, but not if not voluntarily? What is going on? And here we go. I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. Now, the trust is something that was given to a slave or to a servant. And so now we understand the trust then, this statement right here, this trust, the trust that he's been given is to preach. This is why he's compelled to do it. It's not an option for Paul. He has been given a unique trust to go and preach the gospel. Therefore, we can take this sentence here, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. We can understand that Paul is talking about his unique call on the Damascus road. When Paul was called by Christ to be an apostle to the Gentiles, when Paul was told, you are going to suffer for my name through Ananias, Paul is simply discharging the trust committed to me. Does a servant get a great reward when they're just doing what their master was said? And the answer is no reward, right? So he feels completely that he is compelled to preach on account of the trust that's been given him, and there is a woe upon him if he does not preach. He doesn't get a reward, if not voluntarily, I'm simply discharging the trust. He doesn't get a reward for preaching the gospel. He's just not in trouble if he doesn't preach it. I'm sorry, he's not in trouble if he does preach it. Okay? So that's very confusing. I know, I'm sorry. I hope I was clear, but it's kind of hard to follow. What then is my reward? So now Paul asks the question. What then is my reward? If he's not allowed to take money for preaching the gospel, and if he doesn't get some sort of significant reward from the Lord for preaching the gospel, what then is his reward? He doesn't fall into this category of voluntary preachers. He's been uniquely called. He has no option, no other option. Woe to me. What then is my reward? And then he answers the question. Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. How's this for a reward? In preaching the gospel. So this is 1/2 of his reward. In preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge. This is 1/2. You put these two together, and now you have Paul's reward. Paul's reward is not just preaching the gospel. Paul's reward is preaching for free. If it was just preaching, no reward. Paul's reward is that he can do it for free. This violates every concept of our understanding of reward. That's what you should see in this text. What we define reward as is not this, preaching the gospel for free. But for Paul, it is his reward to do it for free. That's the one way that he can get a reward from the discharging of the trust. I mean, he could get paid, but there's no reward for that. That's not a reward. So he forgoes the right. He does not make full use of his rights. Whoops, let me go bigger. He does not make full use of his rights as a preacher of the gospel. What are the full use of the rights? Back up to 15. Money. I do not make use of those rights. What Paul does is he's called a tent maker. He works to support himself in the ministry of preaching the gospel. And because Paul can offer it for free, because a church doesn't have to pay him to be their pastor, now Paul can go be a church planter. Now Paul can move about freely in the ministry. Now Paul can remove that obstacle for the gospel for some. And he can go places that the other apostles can't because he can offer it for free. Which means that for Paul, reward is more spiritual than physical. I'm going to erase that. Sorry. Reward for Paul is more spiritual than physical, and it is more focused on others than self. Wow. This is what the gospel does. It completely changes our concepts of reward and good and a prize. Paul has been so thoroughly affected by the gospel that his reward, he wants it to be a spiritual one, and he wants it to be others focused. And so Paul's reward is to offer the gospel for free. He is completely not consumed with self or the physical. That's not a reward for Paul. He's not interested in that sort of a thing. And it just goes to show the degree of humility, the degree of gospel focusedness that Paul has gained in all of this. If we were to kind of break out this passage one piece at a time, I don't even know how you would do it. It's so difficult to put this all together. But you kind of have your first section. Let me go green at the top. You kind of have this first section in green at the top, that he has not made use of his rights, and then kind of that furthering. And then at the end, you have the same idea, and so not make full use of my rights. And that's the sandwich, if you will, of this text, and everything inside is the meat. This is giving us kind of reasoning, and really, and Paul is explaining the uniqueness of his call, and the nature of reward. And those are the kind of pieces of information that come in the middle of this sandwich that is ultimately about his rights as a preacher of the gospel. And so the second major lesson in this, first, is a redefining of reward. But the second major lesson that we get out of this is what are rights for? Well, not for exercising for our gain, but rather to use or to give up in order that we might better serve others for spiritual purposes. And that is just a beautiful lesson in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 15 through 18.